Welcome to The Disciplined Life. I'm Aria.
And I'm Coda.
We use our experience as a married couple living in a domestic discipline marriage to talk about the ups and downs of implementing authority structure and domestic discipline into modern relationships.
Let's do it. Hello, everyone.
In today's podcast, we are going to be talking through some non-spanking punishments that are kind of common in domestic discipline that we don't use, and we will talk about why. But before we get into that, if you are not already, please do subscribe, hit the notification bell to be notified when we upload new content, like this video, leave a comment, it all helps. And if you want to support the channel further, a link to our Patreon is down below. Without further ado, let's kind of delve into this topic a little bit. So in our relationship, we primarily use spanking as a punishment. I would say at this point, we probably use spanking for about 95% of our punishments.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good gauge.
And even when we do use a non-spanking punishment, it typically is paired with a spanking. And so that's kind of the first point, is that you do not have to do either or. That sometimes you can stack a non-spanking punishment onto a spanking to create a more meaningful and impactful punishment experience.
You really don't want to maybe necessarily limit yourself. So when she's saying that you can mix and match, don't feel like you have to be constricted to only spanking or non-spanking punishments. And so that's why we're saying, give yourself some room to have some different punishments in mind. And obviously we'll go into the details about that, but don't box yourself in too much.
Right, because you don't want punishment to become mundane, and you don't want to limit yourself to doing the same thing every single time. Sometimes variety can really help.
Definitely.
We are going to go through a list of, in this podcast, non-spanking punishments that are common in domestic discipline that we choose not to use, and we'll kind of go over why. However, this list is not going to be exhaustive. There are definitely things that we do not use that could fit into these categories. However, they're not common within domestic discipline. They kind of live more into the BDSM side of things. They maybe play into some fetishes. They are more on the fringes. They're not common within domestic discipline, because if we tried to include all of those things, this would be so extensive and we would not get through it. So we are not including things that are more on the fringes. So if we don't mention something and you're like, I wonder if they use that. If it fits into one of these categories, probably not.
But feel free to leave us a comment or ask the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, this is all about knowing your taken-in-hand partner and knowing how they respond and how they react to certain things, because there are going to be things that we don't use that you might use or probably do use. And that's okay. Like, it is not wrong if you use things that are on our list of things that we don't use, because it's all about knowing your partner, knowing how they react, knowing what their limitations are, and choosing punishments, whether that's spanking or non-spanking, choosing how you approach punishment in a way that honors your taken-in-hand partner and takes into consideration who they are, how they react, and what's going to be helpful for your relationship.
So the first category is that we don't use punishments that involve humiliating your partner. Mm-hmm. And obviously this may seem like a very, very obvious thing, but when you think about it, this may be something that you didn't even realize that would be considered maybe humiliation or not. And we don't really advise that you should do these kinds of things.
Because humiliation for me really does make me feel a sense of worthlessness. And if he was breaking me down in that way to make me feel worthless regularly as a form of punishment, not only would that make me really put the brakes on domestic discipline, it would really change how I view him and how I view our relationship. And it really does have the potential to erode our entire relationship, because it would if I felt like he was purposefully humiliating me and making me feel worthless, that would make it to where the foundation of our relationship that's built on love and trust and integrity and honor, that would break all of those things down. And it really could be detrimental to our overall relationship, not just our domestic discipline. So that's why we don't use those.
Yes, yes.
So again, you may use these things, but it's all about knowing your partner, because the things that I find to be humiliating and degrading to me might work for someone else. So it's all about finding what works for you. So what are some of the things that we don't use because it makes me feel humiliated?
Is washing your mouth out with soap.
And this is very common. And so if you use this, it's not wrong.
No.
It's just not for us.
I'm just laughing because all of a sudden I flash back to my childhood and some things my mother said. But in this is something that we don't use for a bunch of different reasons, because as Aria said, this is makes her feel demeaned. It may even, I've never asked her, but it may put her back into a situation where she feels like she's being treated like a child and some other things. So washing your mouth out with soap, that is definitely a no-no for us. That's not one of those things.
Next thing that would just create a level of humiliation for me in an undue way is forced nudity. Now, we have a child at home, so the practicality of this even being an option is already fairly limited for us. But even if it was an option, I don't think that we would go down that path, because for me, I never want my body to be looked at as something to hide or feel ashamed of. And being stripped of my clothing as a form of punishment would incite those feelings for myself.
Well said. I have nothing to add there. Just that I would say for those of you who may consider this as a punishment, really have some conversations about this, in fact, any of these, before you implement them, to really find out how it's going to affect your partner or not. I would not advise doing any of these that you may think may work for your relationship without having a good conversation about it.
That's really good advice. Yeah.
The next one is, I guess you could use, but we definitely don't use, is belittling your partner.
This is a fine line, because
it really is. It really is.
Because you want to lecture and you want to be able to have kind of that stern talking to, which we definitely do use that element of punishment. However, you don't want it to come across as if you are belittling them or you're degrading them in any way. You don't want your taken in hand partner to feel stupid.
Exactly.
You don't want them to feel worthless. There's a difference between pointing out a mistake, why it was a mistake, and what's expected, and then just making them feel absolutely stupid for what they did.
One of the things that I've always tried to communicate here on the podcast, and even in this, is that even when you are trying to help your partner understand what they did wrong and follow through with the consequences, at the very end of all of that process, it should make them a better person, and in my opinion, build them up and make them want to be a better person and show them how to be a better person, rather than go the opposite direction. And in my opinion, the belittling does the opposite of what you're trying to do in a domestic discipline relationship.
Absolutely. Again, these are not extensive lists. These are just kind of what came to me at the top, because again, we don't use these things, so it's hard to kind of rack our mind around all of the things that we don't use.
But these are some of the big bullet points that we felt like would be helpful in all of these things.
So the next category is punishments that withhold my basic needs. So the first thing within that category is we don't use food as a punishment. I do not lose my ability to have dinner. I don't get sent to bed without dinner. Anything like that. And for obvious reasons, like, I'm a person, I am his wife, I am his taken in hand partner. It's part of his job as the head of household to take care of me, and part of taking care of me is making sure that my physical needs are met.
Now, I want to make sure that this is very, very clear too. This is different than if you were to take away, say, a treat for your partner. That may be, you may have a food treat for them, but this is different. This would be taking away a meal, maybe all 3 meals, maybe one of the meals, however you stack it. That's not something that we do because, again, I want Aria to have proper nutrition. I want her to be able to do things based on the diet that she thinks that she needs to have. And so, but this is definitely separate from maybe taking away a treat or something like that. This is still allowing her to have the basic meals. And so for us, we don't do that. We don't take away any of the meals that she's going to have.
Right. More of a forced fasting, right?
Exactly.
If you choose to fast for health reasons or for religious reasons, that's different.
That's different.
But to have a fasting period enforced as a punishment, just not gonna work for us.
Exactly. Sexual denial. So this is something that, can be a little bit of a touchy subject for everybody, but especially for our relationship, we want to cultivate that part of our relationship. We want to look at that intimacy part of the relationship as a lot of different things, but especially something that, again, builds our relationship up, not tears it down, that it really brings us closer together. And we just feel that if we deny each other our physical need in that way of being intimate and sexual together, that it potentially could, down the line, cause some intimacy problems. And we don't want to do any of that. We want to keep that separate and off the table for punishment. We want that to be purely something that builds our relationship up, that we look forward to, that we enjoy, and that there's no it's not attached to the things that we're trying to do here.
And in that same vein, forced sexual acts.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. Which, again, I just want to reiterate, this may work for some of you. For us, this just not work for our relationship. And again, we really want our sexual intimacy to be something very, very special between the two of us, and something that really is sacred for us. And so we don't want to do anything that might mess with that sacredness and that enjoyable time together. And so a lot of this stuff is just right off the table for us.
And I'm really glad that you used the word sacred, because that's the word I was going to use. I view our sexual relationship as a very sacred part of our marriage. And it's not something that I want leveraged against me in a punishment scenario. Now, that's not to say that sex doesn't have a place within aftercare, within the rejoining process. But that should be a mutually desired experience and a mutually beneficial experience, and something that, again, builds your relationship up, and it's not being leveraged either way between partners, that it's something that is really a mutually beneficial experience. So, withholding access to shared assets. And so in our relationship, I stay home, Kodo goes to work. So we have a lot of assets that are just considered shared assets of our household. And those things include our car. They include the access to our finances. They include access to communication through the basic use of my phone. And I say basic use because there are times where it might be appropriate to limit access to things like social media or apps that may be time wasters, but I should always have access to, this is something within our relationship, the ability to call someone if I need to. And this is really about not being punished in a way that feels constrictive or controlling. The next category is we don't use punishments that trigger past traumas.
This is why we've always talked a lot about, and again, I may sound like a broken record even on this one, but that communication is the key. When you're starting to first talk about this and set up punishments, make sure you talk to your partner about past traumas and to be open about that. There's nothing to be ashamed about. It's nothing to look down upon your partner about, but also it may bring your relationship closer as you talk about them, but it's absolutely key so that you don't put something in a punishment that you didn't even realize would cause a problem with your partner. And again, partners where you may have past trauma and you know that those might be triggers, don't be ashamed of those things. Be open and honest with your partner so that you don't just go along with a punishment that you realize, oh, this might trigger me, but you went along with it just because you didn't want to be vulnerable and open and honest. Be open and honest, be vulnerable so that you can set up punishments that work for your relationship. Again, build yourself up, help the relationship rather than hurt or destroy it.
And don't be afraid if you try, because sometimes triggers can come out of nowhere and you don't really know that something is not going to work for you or something triggers a past trauma experience
Until it happens.
until it
Yeah.
happens. And so if you do go along with the punishment because you think it's going to be fine, like you have no problem with it, you get into the middle of that punishment and you're like, whoa, don't be afraid to communicate that to your partner. This first one on the list was something that happened to us where we were using this as a punishment, and then I had to come to Coda and be like, I can't do this and here is why. And for so that first one that we don't use, that is so common. So again, if you use this, it's not wrong.
It's not wrong.
It's just something that triggers a trauma within me. And so it's wrong for me, but it's not wrong. And that is extended corner time. Um, for myself, I have a lot of like issues with feeling abandoned. And so I can't, so a lot of these are going to be in that theme of really creating connection and creating a sense of security. And so for me, extended corner time, being left alone in a corner, does trigger that feeling of abandonment and that feeling of hopelessness. And it puts me in a really bad headspace to where, and that's the thing with avoiding trauma triggers, is if you are triggering a trauma response, there's not going to be meaningful learning taking place. And it's going to not create like the beneficial outcomes that you're looking for overall. Or the taken in hand partner may avoid doing that behavior again because they want to avoid that trauma inducing punishment. But that's a fear response. That's not an actual like learning and growth. And so if you are aiming to create learning and growth in your relationship, you really do want to avoid traumas, triggers.
The biggest part, as we've already said, is communicate. And if you didn't realize that something was a trigger, again, sit with each other, talk about that, and restructure whenever you need to do that.
So the next one, again, in the same vein as isolation, bedroom time, any type of separation physically, just not going to be for us.
And again, some of the things that Aria already explained for that, but we have just found that isolation, that separation, creates more tension, creates more problems than it actually helps. And so the more that even during the punishment time, even as we're getting ready for that and we're going through those punishments, the more that we're together is what helps rather than the isolation. But again, everybody's different. That may work for your partner. For us, it just didn't seem to work, and so we do a lot more together in the punishment process than we do separate. But you're going to have to try that potentially and see what happens from all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the key with these last two categories, I think, is very important as well. Is if you are doing this as a part of punishment and a trigger happens right away, don't just keep going along with it because it can just get worse as you go. If you automatically get triggered, tell your partner right away, say, I didn't think this was going to trigger me. It has triggered me. And head of households, you may need to pivot quickly to something else, but don't just continue in that to say, no, we agreed upon that. Even though you got triggered right now in this moment, you're going to have to follow through with it. No, stop it at that moment, especially if they express that they've been triggered so that you can pivot to something else.
And we've talked about safe words and we've talked about that. And it might feel very unusual to use a safe word outside of like a spanking scenario. We often think about, a safe word is there that if, for some reason the spanking is getting too much, that they can stop it. It's this is the perfect example of how to use a safe word in a non-spanking scenario, because if you are saying, hey, I need to stop here, and that isn't, maybe the head of household is like, no, we're in the middle of a punishment. Using that safe word can communicate, like, look, I am really serious. I need to stop and we need to have a conversation right now.
Yes.
And that does not mean that the punishment is over and negated and everything's fine. It means that you need to find something else to do. Like, you don't get out of punishment just because you use a safe word. You have to communicate and find something else.
And so, yeah, that was perfect. And that's what I meant by a pivot. So don't stop it, but just pivot into something else, so that you can continue, but that your partner does at that moment feel safe and is not triggered.
And one of the things that I want to bring up, and I feel like this is kind of the right time within this podcast, is the burden of responsibility to communicate is on the taken in hand partner. That is our burden to bear. It is our job to communicate to our heads of household. However, the burden of safety is on the head of household.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
It is the head of household's job to maintain control of the situation, to be aware of what's going on, and to be thinking about how to create the safest environment possible. However, in order to do that, they need the communication from the taken in hand. And so that is why communication is our burden to bear in this scenario.
So if you keep those two things in mind, I think that you'll find that these things actually can be very, very effective. And in all the things that we've talked about in your conversations, if you're keeping both of those things in mind, and again, your roles, it will actually come out exactly the way that you want.
The last thing in this category that we don't use is silent treatment. We do not withhold our communication and our emotional availability on either side. I think that if I tried to give you the silent treatment, that would be punishable. And in turn, you do not punish me with a lack of your availability.
This is, again, something that may work for you. It doesn't work for us, both mainly because, I, at least for me, I grew up in a household where the silent treatment was that way, and it didn't actually help. It made things worse. And so when we were talking about this, I said, at least for me, and I can't deal with the silent treatment. We always need to be talking. We always need to be in conversation. Otherwise, I don't know how to change. Silent treatment, to me, in my opinion, there's nothing good that really comes out of it.
And that's a good point, that these categories are for the head of household and the taken in hand. So for Coda, the silent treatment is kind of trauma inducing, triggering for him. And so this goes both ways. And I know we're talking about non-spanking punishments, but I feel like this is really a good time to mention that when you are choosing implements or how you conduct spanking, really consider these categories as well. And especially this one of what is going to trigger some trauma, if anything, and really have that conversation. Try to figure that out before you get in the middle of it, ideally.
Well said. Well said. So the last category is you want to avoid punishments that are really, truly physically taxing.
And can create unsafe outcomes.
Exactly.
Because there's a difference between, like one of the things on this list is forced exercise. That might not be so bad for a taken in hand that is athletic, that might be in their 30s or 40s. But if you are older or you're not athletic and you're being forced into like extreme exercise as a form of punishment, that can be dangerous, quite frankly.
It really can.
And so you don't want to, that's kind of what we're talking about, is like things that go beyond uncomfortable, that go beyond pushing those limits into potentially dangerous.
And again, this all goes back to what we said earlier, having safeguards in place, making those punishments more practical to your partner and your relationship. rather than just because, again, some of these punishments might be good, but you really need to keep your partner in mind and things that are going to be effective but aren't going to be dangerous for them.
Another one of those things for me is kneeling, um, especially extended kneeling or kneeling on a hard surface, or even like spreading rice or grain or whatever, and kneeling on like small hard objects, kneeling on even like that. I have seen like kneeling pads where there are, you know, objects that make the kneeling more difficult. That's not acceptable for
For
me,
us,
for
for
us.
us.
And again, other people use that. It's very, very common. If that is something that makes sense for you, that is perfectly fine. I have um, very bad joints because of genetics, and also because I was extremely athletic in high school to the detriment of my joint health. So, kneeling for me is not something that is going to be uh, beneficial in any way, shape, or form, and could actually cause long term issues.
So that we keep the punishment gets across, but that Arya remains safe.
Yep. And that's what it's really all about, is knowing your partner, knowing what their particular limits are, and choosing punishments that make sense for your relationship and make sense for the limits that you have within your relationship, and those are all going to be unique. I mean, really, your options for punishments are only limited to your creativity, right? And so this is not an extensive list. This is just an example of things that we have chosen not to use that are kind of common. So we thought we'd bring it up. But again, if you use any of those things and they work well for you and it makes sense for your relationship, and ultimately you are building up and edifying your relationship through the use of punishments, and these things fit into that, that is perfectly fine. They just don't fit into that scenario for us. And so we thought we'd share.
And so we want you, as we talk about with everything in a domestic discipline relationship, we want you to take time and care and communicate, and not take anything in the relationship quickly. Do it slowly, do it meticulously, and start out slow with a lot of these things to find out what works and what doesn't. And then once you have really done this enough and you've had enough conversations, you'll find that a lot of these things do start to work like a well-oiled machine and they go quicker. But at first, be very, very careful, be very, very slow, and have a lot of conversations. And again, take those things one thing at a time to find out what works and what doesn't, so that it benefits your relationship, not tears it down.
Don't be afraid to experiment, but experiment with communication and being educated about where everyone is, so that you don't just go in and make some poor choices.
That can be very detrimental to your relationship if you're not careful. That's why we're
Yeah.
saying take great care and communicate.
Yeah. All right, guys, thanks for joining us on this one. In the next podcast, we will go over the common non spanking punishments that we actually do use. So, hope you join us for that next week. Again, if you want to join our Patreon, the link for that is down below, and we will see you next time.
See you later.